Our next focus is a unique group of immigrants. In 1980, some 125,000 Cubans flooded into Florida from the Cuban port of Mariel. While most of them have settled into routine lives here, there's a group, some 2,500, who ran afoul of U.S. authorities for a variety of reasons. They're now being held by the Immigration Service in facilities around the country. One such facility, the infamous Chrome Avenue Detention Center outside Miami, exploded in violence last week when 100 Cubans being held there clashed with immigration guards. 55 Cubans said to have started the melee were bused to the main holding facility for the Cubans in Atlanta. All of that brings us to our focus tonight. Who are these Cubans who are being held by the Immigration Service, some of them for 6 years, and what is their fate? We'll talk to a top immigration official. But first, Kwame Holman reports from Atlanta, where the largest number of Cubans are being kept behind bars. We have translated the heavily accented voices of 2 of the Cubans interviewed in this report.
This is the 85-year-old Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Once considered so outdated, it was scheduled to be closed in 1978. But today, it's as crowded as ever. Not with Americans, but with 1,800 Cubans. Many of these Cubans spend their days in prison by earning a few cents an hour, making gloves, brooms, and canvas bags for use by the U.S. government. They are illegal immigrants from the 1980 Mariel boat lift, and 300 of them have been here ever since then because they were considered very dangerous. All of the Cubans here are being held indefinitely by the Immigration Service. The government says they are dangerous criminals who should be deported back to Cuba. It is true that most of the men here have committed crimes in America, crimes ranging from major felonies to minor violations of halfway house rules. But almost all of them already have served time in state jails for their crimes. They were brought to the Atlanta pen afterwards by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Craig Rainsford is Associate General Counsel of the INS.
Why is it then necessary to detain them after they've served a state sentence?
Because they have demonstrated a propensity for violence. Many of these individuals are repeat offenders of violent crimes.
Under an agreement reached with Fidel Castro in December 1984, most of these men would have been back in Cuba instead of in a U.S. penitentiary workshop.
Buenos días, Cuba. Está escuchando Radio Martí en el aire hoy.
But last year, the Reagan administration began flooding Cuba's airwaves with Radio Martí, a product of the U.S. government. Castro retaliated by canceling the deportation deal. So the Cuban government won't take them back, and the U.S. government...
I doubt that we will be disposed to release these individuals into the American society at any time until we can either see that there's been a remarkable change in their behavior or that they are returned to Cuba under an agreement such as we had prior to May of '85.
In the meantime, immigration officials and the Federal Prison Bureau, which runs the jail for them, admit that Atlanta is badly overcrowded. 1,800 Cubans live in a facility which was considered full with 1,200. It's so crowded, the INS has promised not to bring any more Cubans here. Congressman Robert Kastenmeier, who recently visited the prison, has written a report critical of the government's policy toward the Cuban detainees.
We cannot just hold them in intolerable conditions in a maximum security prison merely because they are foreign nationals and have no status in this country. They'd be better off to be U.S. prisoners because they would have a term to serve and then they would be entitled to release under our system. But as it is now, they're serving indeterminate sentences, you might say, for having come to this country, as many other Cubans did, illegally.
So for more than a year, these men have been in limbo. No deportation, little hope of release. The level of violence here is among the highest in a federal prison. There have been 7 suicides and 9 murders involving Cubans since 1981. Over 100 Cubans have attempted suicide. Hundreds more have mutilated themselves, according to prison officials. For 15 months, Maximo Martinez has shared a 10 by 20-foot cell with 7 other men in the Atlanta pen.
What did it say? The animal live it more better because these people were here.
Animals live better than these people over here.
In my life, I don't see.
In my life, I've never seen jails like this.
Maximo Martinez served 4 months in a San Francisco area jail for drug possession. After he was released, the Immigration Service took him into custody and brought him to Atlanta.
What do you think every time my family come to see me, my wife explained it to me?
Every time my family comes to see me, my wife tells me, I don't have money. My kid needs this. Lolita needs this. I can't help them. What do you think people feel when their family leaves here?
You might go crazy.
Your mind goes crazy because it gets too much on your mind. But does immigration understand this? Or do Americans understand this? I don't know.
He has no violence on his record. Like I said, the only thing that is on his record is, well, the possession of the cocaine, which he did for, well, he's 6 month sentence he served for.
To be closer to her husband, Joan Martinez came to Atlanta a year ago. She brought their 3 children.
Even in Cuba, it was just for refusing to go into Castro's army. So, you know, he's not violent. He's really, he's always worked, you know. He's always held a job. And they make them out to be so hardcore criminals. I don't think he's violent. He hasn't never been violent with me.
I didn't know how to my record. Any problem for nobody.
I have no record of any problem. I've never had a gun, never had anything. No knife, no nothing.
Armando Maya received a suspended sentence for cocaine possession in San Francisco. He has been in Atlanta 2 years.
People come in one mistake and pay and pay.
People make one mistake, and they pay and pay and pay. 3, 4, 5 times. And nobody can stand that. Everybody sometime in his life makes a mistake, and everybody gets a second opportunity.
Armando Maya and Maximo Martinez typify the debate about the Cubans here and nearly 1,000 more in other INS facilities. Are these men all violent criminals who would pose a threat to society if released? We asked Craig Rainsford about Maximo Martinez and Armando Maya.
We did, at your request, review the 2 individual cases that you had submitted to our public relations office, and we do find that both of these individuals have a lengthy list of the arrest and charge of violent crimes while they were paroled out into the United States.
We checked with San Francisco officials and found that several arrests for violent crimes were attributed to the name Maximo Martinez. But officials there warned us that it is likely that that record was for several men with the same name. Maximo Martinez has no record of violence in the 15 months he's been in the Atlanta pen. The record was clearer for Armando Maya. No charges for anything other than the drug possession and no violence in his 2 years in Atlanta.
It just says the judge has discretion.
These men are lawyers with the Atlanta Legal Aid Society. They are suing the government, charging that the Cubans are being held arbitrarily and should be given access to hearings. Attorney Bill Thompson.
We believe that there are several hundred people at a minimum held out there right now who do not have violent histories and who a fair analysis of the facts in their case would not lead to the conclusion that that individual is in fact dangerous. Those types of people we think should be released.
Their lawyers say the Cubans not only are being detained arbitrarily, but they're being treated arbitrarily in the prison. That treatment began after this disturbance in November 1984. Cubans burned sheets and overran a cell block. The cell block was heavily damaged, but no one was injured or killed. Whether it was a riot, as prison officials call it, or a demonstration of the Cubans' hopelessness, as their supporters say, after that night, the Cuban detainees were locked down. Locked down means kept in their cells 23 hours a day. Today, close to a year and a half later, some 600 Cubans still are locked down, with the promise that they'll continue to be released gradually. Another 300 Cubans are locked down without any promise of release.
This way.
Ours was the first news camera allowed inside the prison since the disturbance of 1984. But prison officials restricted us to the prison workshops. They would not allow us to photograph in the areas where half the Cubans are confined to their cells.
Oh, the lockdown is terrible, you know.
The lockdown is terrible. I don't have the words to say to you what the men feel when they are in lockdown.
Maximo Martinez was placed in lockdown even though he arrived in the prison after the disturbances.
They locking down for 9 months. I in the cell.
They locked me down for 9 months. I ate in the cell. The toilet's in the middle of the cell.
Hey, I got a little.
There's a little hole where they put the food in.
We felt that for the safety of staff and inmates that we would have to lock the entire institution down.
But Warden Jack Hanbury admits that the Cubans in lockdown for 16 months may not be the same ones involved in the demonstrations.
And you're saying that the 600 or so who are locked down now were identifiable as having been participants or instigators?
I didn't say that. I didn't say that at all. I simply said to you that we're not at the point in our relationship with these people that we can trust them being in the general population and not create a situation that would put others in jeopardy.
Then the question becomes, Warden, how is it not then an arbitrary decision as to who gets locked down?
If it's arbitrary, it's based on our best judgment. And we'll continue to operate on that fashion, just like I think you would if you were running this institution. You know, the Cubans, this really doesn't bother them. They've been in worse situations in the past.
The Cuban supporters say the confusion about what these men have or haven't done, both before their arrival here and after, could be solved by giving each of them individual hearings. Hearings like the ones the Immigration Service had in place until 2 years ago.
Between 1981 and 1984, the government did have in place a system called the Attorney General's Status Review Plan, under which agents of INS reviewed individual files, individual cases, and in fact recommended release for up to 2,000 individuals who did in fact gain their release during that period.
When we asked Craig Rainsford about those hearings, he would only repeat his assertion that the Cubans have had ample opportunity to live free in America.
I'm talking about what the lawyers for the Cubans are seeking, which is a parole hearing, if you will, an opportunity for the detainee to say, this is what I think I am prepared to do, this, that, and the other.
Well, the individuals, okay, with you're talking about parole hearings, the individuals have had the opportunity for parole review, as I indicated to you, as they come into the system. They are reviewed as well by our district director as to their past behavior and activities. As you note from my earlier comments, all but 250 to 300 of these people have been out on the street. So they are coming in at different rates, and they're coming in from different locations, and each of them has a different background.
Rainsford says it still is the administration's goal to send many of the Atlanta Cubans back to Cuba. But Congressman Kastenmeier argues that the Reagan administration has not negotiated seriously toward that end.
I think they really would like to, quote, get rid of the Cubans, end quote, get rid of the problem. But they're more devoted to, you know, Radio Marti as a propaganda device than they are to disposing of that problem, at least in that way, in terms of returning any number of them to Cuba.
Kastenmeier says there also are domestic political problems with paroling more Cubans.
They also do not want to accept any responsibility for any future actions of anybody presently being detained that may end up in some additional crime or violent activity in some part of the country. So they're taking the easy solution, and that is sort of throwing away the key and sweeping this whole question under the rug hopeful that no one will pay any attention.
But the problem of the Cuban detainees is one that won't just go away. 2,500 more Cubans now are serving time in state jails and are being released at a rate of 60 per month. Most of them are likely to end up in immigration detention.
The situation remains tense at two federal prisons, one in Atlanta, the other in Oakdale, Louisiana, where Cuban prisoners hold a total of more than 100 hostages and continue to press for a guarantee that inmates will not be shipped back to Cuba. Both incidents were touched off by an agreement with Cuba the Reagan administration announced Friday that included plans to deport the prisoners. In Louisiana today, inmates brought 2 of their 28 hostages to a gate to show that they are being well treated. From Atlanta, where prisoners are holding 75 hostages, we get a report from our correspondent, Kwame Holman.
This afternoon, officials were still battling sporadic fires set by Cuban detainees inside the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary compound. SWAT teams shuttled in and out of the facility throughout the morning, and federal officials maintained a virtual news blackout about the status of negotiations to free 75 prison employees held hostage by about 1,100 Cuban detainees and a handful of American prisoners. In early afternoon, Warden Joseph Petrovsky confirmed that negotiations with detainees had been proceeding, but that progress had ground to a stalemate.
Last night about 7:30, I felt very comfortable that we could have it wrapped up by about 7:45. We found out very quickly that as soon as you agree to a set of demands, a new leadership takes over, and you get a whole new set of demands.
The warden also confirmed that prisoners seen arriving in buses and entering the facility this morning were among some 300 Cuban and American prisoners who broke with the revolt and turned themselves in. The remaining prisoners, who are armed with homemade weapons, also released one prison employee who complained of a health problem. The warden said that only one person, a Cuban detainee, has died in the revolt, and the remaining hostages are being treated well. He said as long as talks with inmates continue, officials will not try to retake the prison by force. But for families of the hostages and for families of the Cuban detainees, the waiting and the worrying continue.
This afternoon, a busload full of relatives of the Atlanta inmates arrived at the Justice Department in Washington, where they pleaded with officials not to send their family members back to Cuba. After a meeting with Associate Attorney General Stephen Trott, the relatives, mostly wives and mothers, made a public appeal to the inmates to free the hostages they're holding.
Please, we beg you, as your families, these men that have these hostages, please let them go. Let's work this out once and for all. We're begging you as your families. Please do it so that we could get on with this and all of us could be reunited at once.
We have promised them a full and a fair and an equitable hearing, that we will take into consideration the crimes that were committed by the people involved, their family situation, any changes of circumstances, any things that we might have missed, any mistakes that might have been made, and that, again, this is a full review with nothing up our sleeve. And it's the best we can offer them, and under the circumstances, we think that this gives them an opportunity to help themselves.
The Associated Press reported today that the offer made by Attorney General Meese yesterday to review each inmate's case did not go beyond the review which each case was due to receive under routine circumstances.
Our lead focus segment comes from Atlanta, where, as we just reported, Cuban prisoners early today released their 89 hostages at the federal prison there. The 8-part deal that finally ended the confrontation was hammered out late yesterday and read aloud to the negotiators by Larry Leshaw, an ACLU attorney who advised the inmates throughout the siege.
Upon the release of all remaining officers being held in the compound at the USP Atlanta, the following agreement will immediately be enforced. 1. Cuban detainees with families and/or sponsors who have already been approved for parole will not have any arbitrary change made in their release decision. 2. The release of the Cuban detainees with no family or sponsor who have already been approved for parole will be reviewed and a decision made within a reasonable time, the process to be completed by June 30th, 1988. All Cuban detainees at USP Atlanta who have not been reviewed yet will receive an expeditious review of their status and those eligible for release will be given the same consideration as those covered by points number 1 and number 2 above. 3. All Cuban detainees at USP Atlanta with medical problems will be sent immediately to medical facilities for evaluation and treatment. Once these detainees are cleared medically, they will be given the same consideration as those covered by points number 1 and number 2 above. 4. Cuban detainees at USP Atlanta who are approved for parole will be given I-94 and other INS documents, including work permit, when they are released. No Cuban detainee will be held by INS without an appropriate charge. 5. No Cuban detainees will be held liable for any damage to this state sustained by the institution during the hostage situation at this facility. There will be no physical reprisals against the detainees. There will be no prosecution except for specific acts of actual assault of violence against persons or major misconduct. This does not include mere active participation in the disturbance, failing to depart Atlanta Penitentiary during the disturbance, or acts causing property damage. 6. It is understood that the American cadre at USP Atlanta did not have any part in this situation and can be removed immediately. 7. Cuban detainees who desire to go to a third country and who are accepted by a third country will be reviewed very quickly and will be permitted to depart with proper documentation and barring criminal action pending. It is the option of any detainee to apply for acceptance by a third country, and any detainee will be given the opportunity to make such an application. Such an application should be made quickly after the disturbance is resolved if a detainee does not have such acceptance already. 8. As previously stated by the U.S. Attorney General, a moratorium has been declared on the return of the Cuban nationals to Cuba with reference to those Cubans who came to the United States in 1980 via the port of Mariel. This moratorium includes all Cubans detained in the U.S. and will ensure a fair review of each Cuban status with respect to his eligibility to remain in the U.S.
This afternoon in Washington, Attorney General Meese and Bureau of Prisons Director Michael Quinlan answered questions from the press. The Attorney General said the Justice Department will conduct an internal review of the prison takeover.
There was a conscious effort on the part of all of us to protect the lives of the hostages. And this was, I think, one of the paramount issues, and to be sure that there were no prisoners or detainees escaping, and to make sure that what occurred in these institutions does not spread over into other institutions or affect the community. I think that in terms of those objectives, all of them were accomplished.
Mr. Meese, was there a failure in not locking down in Atlanta once the disturbance at Oakdale had started?
Well, again, these are not only complex decisions and decisions that are difficult to make because of repercussions no matter what is done, and that's why I think it's more appropriate to answer those as part of a general critique.
Do you feel that you got enough notice from the State Department?
My impression was that we were notified very quickly after the negotiations with Cuba reached a conclusion. As I say, I was notified at 7 o'clock in the morning. I immediately notified the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and they notified the Bureau of Prisons. So that's all I can tell you at this point. Whether there was an opportunity to notify us earlier, that I don't know.
Can you talk a little more about the bishop's role? Was he entering into the negotiations at Turning Point? And what did he do that nobody else seemed to be able to do?
Well, I'll let Mr. Quinlan talk about that because he had more direct contact with him.
I think the critical role that Bishop Ramon played at both Oakdale and at Atlanta was in explaining to the detainees the fairness of the proposal and that the lives of the hostages were very critical, and his urging of them to accept the agreement.
Throughout the week, you said that this hardcore group of dissidents was what was holding up the settlement, that they weren't willing to listen to reason. What did you do, other than having Bishop Ramon help out, to convince these people to listen?
I think that the history will show that the detainees themselves, the majority of the detainees, did what was necessary to convince the others, that this was a fair agreement. And I think also the distribution by the government of leaflets to the general population, where all the prisoners could be, detainees could fully understand what the terms of the proposed agreement were, was a very helpful factor.
The chief FBI negotiator, Mr. Kennedy, said today at one point he came very close to storming the prison. Could you tell us what your thoughts were about that?
The reason we did not storm the prison was that there was no need to. We were prepared obviously, that if there had been danger to the hostages and the lives of the hostages had been threatened, we would have taken whatever action might have been appropriate under the circumstances in the best thinking of the Bureau of Prisons and the law enforcement leaders that were there. But what did happen was consistent with our policy and our plan, and that was to exert extreme patience in deference to preserving the safety of the hostages. And as you see, it did work out satisfactorily.
While Mr. Meese downplayed any threat to the hostages' safety, at least one of the hostages told reporters they were threatened.
People that were guarding us were protecting us.
From?
The other inmates.
Did you feel a threat from those other inmates?
Sure.
Did you ever see them? Did you ever?
Yeah.
What went on? What sort of thing?
Well, the other inmates wanted to kill us. There was a faction that wanted to kill us, and there was one that didn't.
How did you know that?
Well,
did they actually come in and say?
Every now and then they'd come in there and the group, our group would have to fight them off to keep them out.
Physically fight them off.
Right.
Were there weapons involved?
Yeah.
Knives?
Yeah.
Did you ever see any bloodshed or any? We haven't seen. So they were protecting you.
Yeah.
Did they?
That was their job.
Did they explain to you why they were doing that?
Yeah.
What did they say?
They said that they knew it was important to keep us alive because of what they wanted to do. You know, they wanted to bring this to attention of the world, and that was the only way. You know, a lot of them told us, you know, we're sorry, we have to do this, but you know, that's the way it is.